Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoyed this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. The winters in Alaska are harsh, and at the height of winter the air is so cold that it seems hard to breathe. Such was the weather in the Alaskan township, situated almost at the edge of the forest, which was wild and spooky to look at. Waking up early in the morning, Henry Cope set out into the woods for a wolf. Each head of the gray predator was paid generously by the local peasants. But it was not only a desire to earn money, but also the excitement of hunting. Henry and his faithful dog, Dobby, were walking through the deep snow along the river when suddenly his four-legged helper took off and flew headlong into the thicket. Henry thought that Dobby had smelled prey and had his gun ready, but what he saw made him put the gun down. The boy, about 5 or 6 years old, was shivering and hugging the dog to keep warm. The child's feet were wet and already had a crust of ice on them. I wonder how long he'd been out in the cold, Henry thought. It was a long way to pneumonia. However, there was no time to speculate. The man picked up the boy in his arms and carried him into the house. In the warmth, the baby quickly regained consciousness. Hot, delicious food and fragrant tea did their job. "What were you doing in the woods?" Henry asked. "I was on my way to town to see my little sister," said the baby. "My mother was very sick." The baby was almost crying. "Couldn't you call your little sister?" "She lives in a rural village," the boy explained, and sighed like an adult. "My mother said it was impossible to reach her there." Henry nodded. That was true. The connection there was really bad, and so was his, and it was very rare to get through, and even then it was only a word at a time. "Your name is like Daniel." "Well, my name is Mr. Henry." "Here's the thing, Daniel. I'll go over there and see what's happened to your mother, and Dobby will keep an eye on you, all right?" The child nodded, looking trustingly at his savior. "That's good. Don't open the door for anyone. Tell me how to find your mother." Daniel explained where to go rather sensibly for his age. And as Henry was leaving the house, he ran into a guest at the doorway, and his heart ached to see her. It seemed as if he was about to lose his senses. A few years ago, Henry Cope, now a 39-year-old man, considered himself a businessman and quite successful. True, what he did was not very profitable, but at the time, Henry honestly believed that money was not the key to happiness. At that time, he had been a simple painter who painted from life and could only dream of having any kind of decent money. This fact did not bother either Henry or his wife, Nikki. The young woman had a steady job, was an ophthalmologist in a hospital, and, as she liked to say, she was quite capable of covering the rear. However, her mother, Vanessa Wright, strongly disagreed with her daughter's opinion of her son-in-law. This cruel, authoritarian woman, like her daughter, worked in a hospital. Vanessa Wright was the head of the maternity ward. A woman of authority, she literally devoured and nailed everyone in her field of vision, from her subordinates to her husband Hugh, who was a professor. Vanessa Wright thought her son-in-law was a total lowlife. In her opinion, Henry was not a good husband for her daughter. But that was not all. "Honestly, I'm even glad that the Almighty is in no hurry to bestow children on you," she told her daughter once. "Why is that?" Nikki asked with indignation. She was very fond of her mother, but her outbursts against Henry were very upsetting and hurtful to the young woman. "Because you can't bring him up if you're as clueless as you are." Vanessa Wright cut him off, not embarrassed by her own tactlessness. The daughter only shook her head. A few years ago, Nikki had been pregnant. That joyous event had forced Henry to quit painting and look for a more serious job. He was lucky. Almost immediately, Cole Reynolds, an old friend, called and invited him to work. "The money is good," assured the comrade. "What should I do?" "On construction. The employer is trusted, so there won't be any problems." Everything was working out just fine. After some simple calculations, he was jubilant by the time his wife returned from the maternity hospital. They had a stroller and a crib for the baby. Plus, construction wasn't too far away. So Henry could come home. Nicky was very happy too. On one visit home, he was annoyed to find his mother-in-law. He was annoyed to find his mother-in-law visiting and the baby's things, obviously bought by her. Of course, Vanessa Wright didn't miss an opportunity to drive her son-in-law mad. "You were hungry, you'll die hungry," she said. How she nailed it with obvious pleasure. Henry, realizing that his mother-in-law wanted a scandal, decided not to give in to the provocation. But, apparently realizing that all was not lost, she continued her execution. "See what this is? It's the baby's dowry I had to buy. And do you know why? Because a poor bastard like you can't even give my daughter a piece of bread, let alone a baby carriage and a diaper." The calculation was correct. What's the big deal? Vanessa Wright was an excellent psychologist. She knew where to hit. Take all that mother-in-law stuff back and shove it in one place. Henry got angry. "Just so you know, I brought enough money to buy a stroller and clothes for our baby." "Really?" exclaimed mother-in-law. "How nice." "Well, you can, as you like to say, shove that money in the same place and save it for a rainy day, which I'm sure is not far off." He brought the money. Vanessa Wright snorted contemptuously and remembered how 7 years ago Henry had courted her daughter and given her daisies. "So?" her daughter asked perplexedly. Nicky had wanted to intervene for a long time, but it was impossible to get a word into her mother's fiery monologue. "You should have presented roses," Vanessa answered admonishingly. "And I like daisies," Nicky said. "And that's not what I remember. I remember Henry running to my place on the day of the wedding because his car broke down, which was, by the way, 15 kilometers. Yes, it was dirty and in the shade, but he made it to the wedding. That's the deed, not the roses." Henry grinned and looked at his mother-in-law. On the eve of the marriage, there had been a visit from her. Vanessa Wright tried to dissuade him from marrying Nicky, arguing that her daughter was used to affluence and comfort. Intercepting her son-in-law's gaze, Vanessa Wright averted her eyes. That was true. He was hungry, and she almost laughed at the memory of it. The woman even regretted not going to the marriage ceremony, though she had been invited. It would have been interesting to see the look on the faces of the registry office staff. Who could have known that Henry would arrive in one piece? Needless to say, the wily Vanessa had a hand in it, hiring an alcoholic former locksmith who cut the brake hose for a nominal sum turned out to be no problem at all, except that she never expected Henry to swerve into the pond and thereby save his life. 10 minutes before the registration, the mother-in-law had settled into the thicket of a maple tree and was watching her daughter and the invited guests, hoping that she had succeeded. What was her amazement when Henry showed up at the registry office in person? What a brute, Vanessa Wright thought with hatred, glancing at her son-in-law. "I'll get even with him now." "The deed," she mocked her daughter with an unkind twinkle in her eyes. "Well, if your little man is capable of the deed, start at last to support the family." "Wonderful," Henry exclaimed. "No money, too bad, and no money too bad. So, Nicky, I just came by to give you some money and to pick up a few things to change. So I'm leaving." "Already?" the wife grumbled disappointedly. "Yeah, Nicky, I gotta go. I saw you. When the construction is over, we'll spend more time together." "Yeah," Vanessa Wright inserted her own words, "and we'll eat the last piece without salt." "That's what you meant to say." "I wanted to say what I said." The angry mother-in-law did manage to piss him off. Only it was not for the ears of the flighty lady, who had already annoyed everyone, including her trembling husband. "Isn't that right, Hugh Wright? How dare you, you brat?" The professor, who was also visiting his daughter and son-in-law, tried to intercede for his wife. "Yes, I am. Yes, I am you." "Shut up already," Vanessa shrieked. "I'm not the one who can't say a word, and let's go home." "Whatever you say, darling," said the spouse, staring into the eyes of his other half. Henry was terribly disgusted. "Bye, honey," he said, kissing Nikki, then hurrying toward the door. "How could it be?" She almost cried. She exclaimed. "And that's it. You've had enough," my husband shouted. "I've had enough of your merry family. I don't know what you want anymore. I don't know what you want anymore." And Henry walked away proudly, slamming the door loudly. What was Henry thinking about? Cole asked. The friends were resting in the barracks after a hard day's work, which for Henry lasted forever. He berated himself for his intemperance, but he never dared to call his wife and apologize. And for that, Henry hated himself even more. And he was so preoccupied with his own thoughts that he didn't even hear the question. "What do you think I'm asking?" "No reason," Henry answered evasively and sighed heavily. "Current affairs worries. A cheerful, friendly family overtaking," my friend guessed. Henry and Cole had gone through many hardships together, so the friends had no secrets from each other. That's not the word, but that's not even the worst part. And he told Cole about the warm family reunion. "I hadn't cared what that woman thought of me for a long time," Henry said, "but I'd had a stupid breakup with Nikki, and now I was cursing myself, and Nikki shouldn't be bothered." "Yeah, that's not the point." A friend agrees, "And you're still sitting there, Henry. If I were you, I made up with my wife a long time ago. Call her, call her, call her." Henry dialed his wife's number, and she answered immediately. "Waiting," he guessed, and his heart ached. "Yes?" Nikki answered without any intonation. "Nikki," Henry muttered, and his throat suddenly became dry. Since the first day of their married life, he and Nikki had lived together, and this was their first quarrel. Henry didn't know what to say, and he was angry with himself again. "I'm listening to you," Nikki said in an even voice. "God, it's hard to apologize to the woman you love if you don't just want to say, 'I'm sorry,' but to find the right words to convey the sincerity of remorse. But nothing like that came to mind, and Henry had no choice but to mumble, 'Nikki, I'm sorry.' 'I've already forgiven you,' my wife replied, and there was a slight smile in her voice, and also relief. Or so Henry thought. "Really?" "No, I was joking." She giggled and then added seriously, "Henry, I know it's not easy with Mom. I'd probably do the same thing if I were you." "I know." "No, really. Anyway, forget it. Let's talk about something more pleasant because you were so dashing." They talked for an hour, and when Henry passed out, his eyes lit up. He was ready to hug the whole world, but he confined himself to a friend. "Hey, too bad Nikki wasn't around." "There, that's another thing," Cole said approvingly. Vanessa Wright sat in her office, savoring her victory. She was triumphant. Jean was out of the bottle. The son-in-law had signed his own verdict with his last words, for he'd said he was fed up with their family and wasn't Nikki part of it. That was it, and this loser would never be part of their family, no matter how many times he and Nikki were married. Once they were married, they'd go their separate ways. It wasn't for this walking misunderstanding that she'd raised, nurtured, and cherished her only daughter. By the way, shouldn't I call my daughter, so to speak, to support Nikki in her time of need? "Hello, darling." She greeted her daughter in a honeyed voice. "Hi," replied Nikki cheerfully. "How are you feeling?" Vanessa asked in the voice of a caring mother. "That's just great." She sounded funny for a woman who had a fight with her beloved husband, Vanessa Wright thought uneasily. "Isn't your husband bothering you? That's why I'm asking Nikki." She was singing her heart out. "We should get a divorce, and there will be no divorce." Nikki replied with a smile. "Henry and I made up, but he insulted our whole family." "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "Mom, I'm begging you." "What's so offensive?" Henry said. "Everything he said was true. You're really trying to get everyone under you. And you've made Henry's life a living hell. What's the matter with him?" "He's not your type," Vanessa Wright said angrily. "Let me decide that for myself," Nikki replied. "Maybe you haven't noticed this, but I'm a big girl now, and I'll decide for myself who I live with." "Suit yourself," my parents sighed, "but don't say you weren't warned." "Warned about what?" The young woman grinned. Mommy, you underestimate Henry, but I love him. I heard you. We'll see whose it is. Vanessa Wright thought angrily. I swear they won't be together. After talking to her mother, Nikki felt uncomfortable. She always did. In fact, she went to bed, but she couldn't sleep. Finally, the young woman managed not even to fall asleep, but forgot herself. But after a while, she awoke to a suspicious dampness. Nikki, a trained medical professional, didn't need to explain what it was. God, not again. Terrified, she thought. The situation couldn't be worse. My husband was away at work, and the only person who could really help was my mother. Okay, I get it, Mom replied nonchalantly. Nikki, don't panic. Everything will be fine. Vanessa Wright tried to speak in a calm, businesslike tone, but Nikki sensed the excitement in her mother's voice, which was quite normal. After all, this is her grandson's life we're talking about. You've got to hand it to Wright. She arrived promptly. On the way, she called the midwife on duty at her small hospital and sent her employee home. Why, Vanessa did not know herself, but something told her it was worth doing. How are you? My mother asked me from the threshold. I'm having contractions and it hurts. It really hurts. Don't worry, honey. Everything will be all right. It will be, Vanessa Wright thought. A plan matured in her mind after examining the woman in labor. Vanessa determined that labor was not going to be easy. The situation was further complicated by the fact that there was a heavy blizzard outside. No, we can't get to the regional hospital anyway, Vanessa Wright thought. Even with the best of luck, we'll manage on our own. Can you walk? She asked her daughter. Yeah, I guess so. Well, that's great. I'll take you to the hospital myself. In this blizzard, we'll be waiting for emergency services until morning. Vanessa Wright promptly brought her daughter to the hospital in her Mercedes and began to prepare her for labor. Nikki was unconscious, but thank God her life was out of danger. At 1:35 p.m., Nikki gave birth to a strong and healthy baby boy, but alas, she was not allowed to see her son as he came into the world. A grandchild, a blood child, Vanessa Wright thought with tenderness. After placing the newborn in the cradle, she went to deliver the next baby. The next woman to give birth was one Stephanie Stevens, a girl of easy virtue. When Stephanie found out she was pregnant, her first thought was to get rid of her. But what the hell was the baby if she didn't even know who the father was? But there was no money. So Stephanie ended up missing all the deadlines. You've got to be kidding me. Susan's friend shook her head. So maybe it's destiny. You'll settle down and be a good mom. Eddie, are you kidding me? No, Susan sighed. Time goes by, we're not young. This way we'll have someone to fetch us that glass of water. Stephanie wondered. Well, maybe her friend had a point. Except that the idea of being a good mom wasn't exactly inspiring. Who knows, though? Maybe it would come in time. The whole pregnancy, Stephanie wore tight clothes, smoked, occasionally allowed herself to drink something strong. In a word, did not take care of her future offspring at all. In the end, her baby girl was stillborn, which did not sadden Stephanie at all. On the contrary. This did not escape Vanessa Wright's keen eye. In her mind, a plan was instantly formed. How are you feeling? Asked Vanessa, the failing good mother. Quite, Stephanie nodded. I can't wait to leave this nice place. When will I be discharged? They will, Vanessa said, and they'll take a look at you and I think you can go home tomorrow. Why not today? The woman stretched out disappointedly. For today, I want to offer you a deal, said the headmistress nonchalantly. A deal. The maiden was perplexed. Deal, Vanessa Wright confirmed, and told Stephanie what she had to do. But of course, not for free. I'll pay well, and taking out the phone, the supervisor wrote a number on the screen. The maiden didn't have to be persuaded for long. What difference does it make as long as it pays such an impressive sum of money? Without thinking long, Stephanie substituted Nikki's live and healthy baby for her stillborn. She felt no grief for the dead child. Why is that? Nikki sobbed when her mother told her the sad news. After all, the pregnancy proceeded normally. It happens. With a feigned sympathy, Vanessa Wright replied, "You were unconscious, you couldn't push, and the baby suffocated. I can't believe it." Nikki shook her head, but that wasn't all. Nikki wouldn't be able to have any more children. The young woman felt like she was going to die of grief. What was there to live for now? She thought. Nothing made Nikki happy. The home in which she and Henry had been so happy seemed foreign and uncomfortable. Her husband, upon learning of the tragedy, had gone home and prudently hid the children's devotional bought by her caring grandmother, but he might as well not have done so. It seemed as if it could not get any worse. Henry wasn't the least bit relieved. He'd been looking forward to this baby. God, why are we doing this? Thought the poor man. What were these sins? It was a couple of days before work ended, but Henry decided to take an early day off. He needed it more at home. Nikki stood on the bridge, staring thoughtfully at the frozen water. How wonderful it would be to disappear into the depths of the river, and not to think about anything else. She knew it was a very dangerous place. This year alone, 2 visiting ice fishing enthusiasts had drowned here. For some reason, the water wasn't freezing here, and the ice was thin. The February thaw did its job. The glare of the sun played on the ice and froze. At other times, Nikki might have remarked that it was beautiful. But now she was not concerned with the local beauties. The young woman had only one thing on her mind. It wouldn't be long before she was with her baby boy. Nikki had already thrown her leg over the railing when suddenly someone's strong hands grabbed her by the waist and placed her on the wooden planks. "Henry, how are you here?" she exclaimed in amazement. Henry was taking the bus home, and a bad feeling gripped him. He shooed the bad thoughts away as best he could, but they kept creeping into his head, thereby rushing him home. Henry was sitting by the window, crossing the bridge to their town, and immediately noticed a familiar figure in a delicate blue ski suit. Nikki was looking out to the river, and something told him his wife hadn't come here to admire the winter and river scenery. Henry ran up to the driver and shouted desperately, "Friend, please stop. I'm begging you." The driver looked at him unhappily, apparently thinking that the man was drunk or something. "Please," he insisted. It was a matter of life and death. Who knows what the driver had in mind, but he obeyed, and as it turned out, just in time. By the time Henry ran up to Nikki, she had already thrown her leg over to do the terrible thing. "Did you think of me?" her husband asked, not paying attention to her question. "Have you thought about how I'm going to live without you? About my parents?" "Parents?" sobbed the young woman. "And they don't need me now." "What do you mean?" Actually, Henry suspected that in some way they did, but it seemed that Nikki had something specific in mind. "Well, we'll talk about that later. Right now, the main thing is to calm the poor girl down." "I need you," he whispered, pulling Nikki against his chest and kissing the top of her head tenderly. "You and I will get through this. We are strong together. It's the only thing worth living for us. Do you hear, Nikki?" Nikki whispered and smiled shyly. Hearing. Henry said something else soothing, but she didn't listen to him anymore. She felt so good in her husband's arms, so good that the thought of suicide seemed absurd. So what did it matter what he said? The important thing was that her beloved spouse was with her, and Henry was right. The two of them would get through anything. "Well, that's great," my husband smiled. "And now home." Historically, the Wright and Cope family had been so. The happier Henry and Nikki were, the uglier her mother was. And of course, vice versa. No, Vanessa Wright had nothing against her daughter being happy, with one correction, with someone else. But Nikki could be happy only with Henry, and her parent had nothing to do but to disgrace the young family in every possible way, as if mocking her daughter and son. In-law, Vanessa and her husband decided to adopt a boy who was their own grandchild. Hugh Wright, however, was not aware of this. Adoption was rigged in a flash. Stephanie wrote a waiver in favor of a respectable married couple, and thanks to the Wright connections, Vanessa Wright was able to arrange everything in the best way. Now, the elderly lady was almost content, almost because Nikki and Henry were still together, which was in no way her plan. The treacherous woman Vanessa had counted on the baby's death to ruin the young family. After all, as she reasoned, Henry, upon learning that Nikki was barren, would leave her immediately. However, Vanessa's calculations were wrong. The young couple's relationship only grew stronger. They began to treat each other more reverently. Nikki slowly came to her senses and returned to work at the hospital. Henry took up drawing from life. Life was getting better, and Vanessa Wright couldn't be said to have been thrilled about it. But she reasoned that, not all at once, there would be a day, there would be food. The main thing was that Daniel was with them. That's right, too. How could she trust such parents to bring up their children? She and Hugh were no different. Vanessa still did not miss a chance to make fun of her son-in-law. And even the fact that the couple often went to visit the grave of another man's child and the poor woman wept on her knees had not softened her mother's heart in the slightest. It was too much for Nikki to bear, and communication with her mother had all but disappeared. If she didn't want nice things, then so be it. Let the child grow up and enjoy life, and she and Henry have their own lives. And then Vanessa decided to take her last chance. What if? The idea didn't come up all at once. One day Vanessa was walking from work and saw Stephanie. The woman was crossing the road. What can I say? She was a hell of a woman. Back at the hospital, Vanessa had not been able to appreciate her dress behind her robe and slippers. But now Stephanie appeared to her in all her glory, her brown hair curled into coquettish curls, bright, rather spectacular makeup, a short red dress that emphasized the seductive figure, a light white raincoat, and high heels. The girl walked past Vanessa, gating from the hip, without even looking at her. "Stephanie," the woman called out. "Excuse me, are you talking to me? Do you see anyone else here?" Vanessa Wright grinned. Indeed, Stephanie grinned back. "Do you remember me?" "Well, you bet." She smiled. "That's something you'd probably forget. Is there something you want, or is this just a way of saying hello?" Vanessa realized what she had to do. This girl had been sent to her by fate itself. "Stephanie, aren't you in a hurry?" the conniving schemer asked frantically. She tasted big, easy money and decided that Stan would wait today, and if he didn't wait, it wouldn't matter much. "No, actually," Stephanie held out. But deciding to put a price on herself, she added, "What?" "I'll take care of it if I have to," Vanessa Wright hastened to assure me. The old acquaintance realized that the fish was already hooked and graciously agreed to negotiate. Or else, what else is there to find? No, it's not that important. "So I'm listening to you," Stephanie said with a smile. "But not here. There's a cozy cafe nearby. Shall we go in?" Well, all right. The women entered the cafe, took seats, and only after the order was placed did Vanessa ask the unexpected companion, "How's it going?" "I guess everything is the same. Does this have anything to do with what you want to ask me?" Wow, the girl's not as dumb as I thought she was. Vanessa thought, surprised, so much the better. "Imagine I do. It's a delicate assignment, and you have to give it your all. But if you're married with everything going on, maybe that will stop you." "No, I'm not married," Stephanie answered. "Anyway, what should we do?" This time, the restless Vanessa asked Stephanie to seduce her son-in-law. This was unexpected. "What are you looking at?" Vanessa Wright asked with a chuckle. "You'd think it would be that hard for you." "No, of course not." "But how am I going to cross him? I can't just show up at their house." "With an interesting proposition. Exactly home," the companion smiled broadly. My son-in-law is a clumsy painter who draws from life, so you'll come to him as a model. How can you not draw such a pretty little thing? By the way, you don't have to sleep with him, though. Of course, if he doesn't mind, that's even better. Stephanie agreed. Life really wasn't settled, and you want money. It's easy to make men feel good about themselves, but it's not always pleasant. Alas, and here is such a dusty job. What's the price of the question? Stephanie asked, looking intently at Vanessa. And when she wrote the answer on a napkin, she shook her head in the negative. I want twice as much, she declared. Aren't you cracking anything? It won't crack. It's your life that's going to crack. Remember what you asked me to do 5 years ago. Of course, I'm not good at legal stuff, but I'm guessing this is a lawsuit. So pay me double, or that story will come out, and no amount of connections will help. I have powerful friends, too. Stephanie grinned. And you'll go far, Vanessa said. If they don't stop you, blackmail is dangerous. Don't tell me how to live my life. If anyone needs it, it's you, but I've made sure of that. Our nice conversation recorded, Stephanie pulled out her smartphone, pressed the right record. Vanessa Wright heard her own voice. By the way, you don't have to sleep with him at all. Although, of course, if he doesn't mind, that's even better. The recording has already been sent to one person. So Stephanie fluttered her arms with a smile. You're such a bitch, Vanessa hissed. No more than you, though I would call it something else. Smart and enterprising woman? Well, yes, I won't argue with you. So what about the double fare? To hell with you. I'll give you double fare. Come to my house the day after tomorrow. We'll discuss the details. I'll text you the address. Vanessa Wright understood. She had fallen into her own trap, but there was no turning back. The girl was a bit of a teetotaler. After saying goodbye to Stephanie, she thought that everything was not so bad. The main thing was to make it work, and the money would come in handy. Besides, this time Vanessa was sure that now she would be able to get rid of her hated son-in-law. Nikki wouldn't forgive the betrayal. Stephanie entered the right home and thought, here is not poor, in fact, who would doubt it? Well, if I behave intelligently, I will live no worse. The women sat in the living room and discussed the nuances of cooperation. Stephanie had already received the money, so she was in high spirits. I can't tell you how nice it is to work with you, Stephanie murmured in a social tone. Likewise, darling, Vanessa Wright smiled falsely, hearing footsteps in the hallway, added, here came Hugh and Daniel. An interesting, intelligent-looking man and a little boy entered the house. The child did not interest Stephanie, but the man. By the way, he looked at her with marked interest. Do we have company? Vanessa's husband asked with a smile. Hum, she hummed and thought. So much for the old peacock's tail. So introduce me to your charming acquaintance, he asked. Stephanie is my husband, Professor Hugh Wright. Hugh. Stephanie introduced them to each other without much enthusiasm. Vanessa remembered how her husband had entertained students of the university where he lectured in philosophy in his younger years. Well, let him. All that is in the past. The professor's interested look amused Stephanie at first. But suddenly she thought maybe it was really worth killing two birds with one stone. It seems that the professor was sick to death of his flighty tyrant spouse. Surely there is no conjugal relationship there anymore. And this Hugh is an interesting man. Stephanie winked cheerfully at the professor, to which he smiled. She was sure she would do well now. The main thing was to complete his trembling wife's assignment. And then Stephanie would take on the professor. Hello, Henry, Stephanie asked in a businesslike manner. I did, they said on the other end of the line. I'm calling your ad. I really liked the samples of your work, so I decided to place an order. You draw from life, don't you? That's exactly right. Now, I'd like you to draw me. I'd like a quote, please. After Henry had quoted the price, Stephanie asked, not without coquetry, I hope you won't be embarrassed by the fact that you have to paint me in my negligee. I assure you no. The artist laughed. I've painted naked women. And a doctor doesn't mind the nudity of his patients, does he? After all, it's all about making a living. That's right, too, Stephanie said with a smile. Henry worked in a garage set up as a studio. That's where he invited Stephanie. Nikki was discouraged. Was it really her mother? Vanessa with a cake and a bottle of expensive champagne? That in itself is nonsense. But for her to ask her daughter to forgive her was beyond fantasy. And yet Nikki wanted to believe in her mother's sincerity. After all, they were family, and that meant that they shouldn't antagonize each other. "Come on, Nikki," Vanessa Wright sang in a sweet voice. "Let's have some cake, your favorite chocolate cake. With champagne is very good. And if you don't want, we can have tea." "You know, Mom," decided Nikki, "I might as well have some champagne. After all, it's not every day her stroppy mother comes to make up." "Well, that's great," Vanessa rejoiced. Mother and daughter drank delicious champagne and snacked on cake. To tell you the truth, Nikki felt a little out of place. She seemed happy that her parent had, in her own words, realized she had been wrong. She had also made the first move, but her daughter's behavior seemed somehow unnatural. However, after some thought, Nikki decided that her mother was just uncomfortable. She had always been a stranger to sentimentality, hence this behavior. Nevertheless, a couple of glasses of champagne had a relaxing effect, and soon the awkwardness disappeared. "And you know the daughter. I have a suggestion," Vanessa Wright said excitedly, looking at her watch. "Which is it?" "You're gonna love it." My mother smiled and was cryptically silent. "Mom, don't be stiff and I'm all ears. I suggest we get some more champagne and go to Henry's garage. I want to make up with him, so why put it off, right?" No, my mother was definitely switched, an astonished Nikki thought. But on the other hand, they can't feud forever. "He's probably in the garage now, isn't he?" Vanessa asked. "Yes," Nikki nodded. "He's got some new order now." "We know his order." Her mother grinned to herself. Vanessa Wright hailed a cab and they drove to Henry's garage, stopping at the specialty wine store beforehand. Vanessa didn't recognize any others. Nikki was so happy that she didn't even pay attention to the way her mother nervously looked at her watch. Nor was she alarmed when Vanessa asked the cab driver if she could go any faster. Vanessa Wright was not the only person straining to look at the time. Stephanie dutifully assumed the right postures, but still glanced at the large wall clock that hung in the workshop, and at exactly 6:00 p.m., Stephanie suddenly rose from the sofa on which she was posing and wiggled her hips toward Henry. She sat on his lap and kissed him passionately on the lips. The model was wearing a very racy black transparent negligee, and she looked very tempting, and the monk would not have been able to resist. But Henry loved Nikki and never even thought of cheating on her. "Stephanie, what are you doing?" he asked confusedly, gently pulling the girl away. "What was that for?" Suddenly the garage door swung open and Nikki entered, accompanied by the esteemed Vanessa Wright. What happened next reminded Henry of a bad joke. Stephanie was sitting on his lap, but Henry was in such a stupor that he didn't even think to remove her from him. "Is that what you're ordering?" Nikki couldn't believe her eyes. She exclaimed, "That's what I thought," my mother-in-law said. "I always knew Henry was rotten." Stephanie wanted to insert her own words, for instance, and say something like, "Dear, maybe it was better that your wife found out about it," but she realized in time that the artist would have figured out the frame up, and then it could have spoiled her plans for the future. In truth, Stephanie felt sorry for him, but it was nothing personal. She was just doing her job. She, unlike Nikki, didn't have anything handed to her on a platter. Vanessa Wright walked away proudly, and Stephanie smiled awkwardly. "Well, I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me." Henry sat with his arms around his head. "You'd better leave," he said, and the maiden obeyed. As she left the garage, Stephanie was surprised to realize that she was ashamed. Henry, recovering from his shock, called Nikki, but his wife didn't answer. "We must give her time," he decided. Henry came home late at night and, to his dismay, Found his mother-in-law there. What are you doing here? She put her hands to Vanessa Wright's sides. Well, first of all, I came to my house, he replied nonchalantly. And secondly, I want to talk to my wife. And your wife doesn't want to talk to you. Why don't I ask her that myself? Yes, please, my mother-in-law whispered. Mom's right, Nikki said in an icy voice as she walked in. We have nothing to talk about. I'm filing for divorce. But it wasn't my fault, Henry exclaimed. I didn't cheat on you. Really? The wife grinned bitterly. And I saw this lady sitting on your lap. It's not what you think. No. I like that phrase. Vanessa laughed. This girl was sitting on your lap kissing you, and it turns out it's not what we thought. What you, dear mother-in-law, think is of no concern to me at all. And with Nikki, we can unite ourselves without your person. Are you deaf? She grinned. Nikki made it clear she didn't want to talk to you. Nikki sat in her chair staring at one point. From the outside, it looked as if what was happening had nothing to do with her. Leave me alone, she screamed and jumped out of her chair. That's it, go away. Son-in-law and mother-in-law glanced at each other and left the apartment. Vanessa Wright was the first to leave, and when she saw her son-in-law coming out the door, she clearly wanted to say something to him. But Henry didn't give her the satisfaction. He looked at Vanessa like she was nothing and walked away. At first, Henry wanted to go to his parents, but decided not to involve them in his problems. God willing, everything would work out. He decided to call Cole, who lived alone. Buddy, will you take me in for a few days? He asked his faithful friend until I found a place to live. What are we talking about? Live as long as you like. So Henry went to Cole's house. But so are the cases. Cole whistled as he listened to his friend's story. It seems to me that your mother-in-law has been very cleverly set up. It's a little too timely with the model and Nikki's visit with her mother. You think I haven't thought about it myself? Henry grinned dryly. But where's the proof? And then maybe it wasn't a setup. And maybe it wasn't a setup. And maybe Vanessa had tracked down Stephanie and decided to enlighten her daughter. Also an option, by the way. Yeah, Cole shook his head. But don't worry, we'll get through it. You love each other so much. To be honest, I've always been jealous of you. I thought I'd meet someone like your Nikki and have a love like yours. I wouldn't think twice about getting married. You two have always been the reference for me, the benchmark. Henry sighed. I wish the angry mother-in-law wasn't there. Well, my buddy shook his hands. Nothing in this world is perfect, alas. Friends sat in the kitchen and analyzed the situation with whiskey. But what can I say? If you love, fight for your love. And Henry fought. He kept watch over his wife outside the house and the hospital, trying to convince her that he was as clean as a baby in front of her, but in vain. Henry never succeeded in convincing his wife and the couple, to everyone's surprise, divorced. It's over. Desperate, he told his friend and parents. A week after the divorce, he decided to retire to an empty hunting lodge he had once seen while wandering aimlessly through the woods, to become a hermit. He said, either jokingly or seriously. Without Nikki, life had no meaning anyway, and at the same time there was some serious drama playing out in the city. Henry didn't want to know anything about these people, but if he'd had the urge, he might well have thought he had his revenge. The day after the ridiculous scene in the garage, Stephanie began to put her cunning plans into action. He learned that Professor Wright was lecturing at the university. Well, that's where Stephanie is going to catch Hugh Wright. It was just a matter of finding out what days and what times he was there. One day, when the professor was leaving the university building, Stephanie allegedly accidentally bumped into him and broke her heel. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so embarrassed, she muttered, furtively looking at the professor, and he seemed to be falling for it. No, I'm sorry. Hugh Wright objected, helping Stephanie gather the contents of her purse. Their hands accidentally touched, which clearly embarrassed the professor, and only now it occurred to him. Had he seen this beauty and not anywhere but in his cottage, or was he mistaken? No, I don't think so. Stephanie. Wright didn't seem too sure. Yes, the maiden responded with an ostensibly surprised look. Isn't your name Hugh Wright? Quite right. The venerable professor nodded with a smile. You know what, Stephanie? I have a suggestion. Stephanie grinned. She seemed to be having déjà vu. Curious, Stephanie whispered. Here's a suggestion. Now you and I go to the store, I buy you shoes, and then we have lunch at a very cozy restaurant. What do you say? Well, it's kind of awkward. She stretched out. And then I'm not dressed for the restaurant. Come on, Stephanie. And Hugh smiled even wider. You broke your heel, and like a true gentleman, I want to make it up to you. It's your own fault, waved her hand. You should watch where you're going. It doesn't matter, he said. It's just not my policy to leave a lady alone with her misfortune. But as for clothes, I assure you, you are beautiful in any outfit. However, if it bothers you that much, we can buy a dress at the same time. No, not at all. You know, I think I'll take you up on your offer. To be honest, I'm really hungry. Well, that's great. The professor rejoiced. My carriage is waiting for us in the parking lot. Hugh Wright shook hands with the lady, and they headed for the car, ignoring the prying eyes of the students. And our Hugh Wright, it turns out, is no slouch, commented one of the students. I thought he was all right. They're all the same, her friend snorted. Even the strict professor is no stranger to anything human. They say his wife's a bitch. Well, no wonder then. The professor bought Stephanie shoes, and they went to a restaurant. And how did you meet Vanessa? Hugh asked. With Vanessa. Stephanie asked again. Well, we were like having some kind of reception or something, a banquet or something. Well, I see, he smiled. Vanessa loves this case, and so do you, it seems. Well, that's clear. You women have a weakness for showing off your outfits. You know, I hate the whole thing. Really? Yes, that's it. The professor shook his hands. I'm a homeboy. That night they took a long walk around the city, and then they went to a hotel. You probably thought I was a woman of easy virtue, Stephanie asked, snuggling up against the professor's shoulder. Not at all, he whispered, kissing his lover. They dated for a couple of months, and then the professor informed his wife that he was leaving her. I fell in love with someone else, the spouse declared. What kind of news is that? Vanessa exclaimed. Who needs you? Well, apparently you do. Vanessa, let's face it. Our marriage has been over for a long time. First you did nothing but poison our daughter's life. Then you disappeared into Daniel. No, I'm fine with the boy, of course, but what the hell is my place in your life? There we are talking, aren't we? What would you be? Don't do that. Hugh Wright stopped his wife with a wince. Your desire to sting me is predictable, but it won't change anything. At that moment, Vanessa Wright clearly realized that Hugh really will leave and never come back. And the implication that Hugh owes his career to her father is really not much of an argument. Vanessa knew better than anyone. Hugh was bright-headed, but, she thought, lacked character. Vanessa Wright was sure that Professor Wright, a flunky she could twist as she wished. Turns out she was wrong. And who is this perfect woman that I should look up to? Vanessa asked sarcastically. No, I'm just curious. What difference does it make? Hugh sighed and went to pack his things. When Vanessa Wright found out who her husband had exchanged her for, she laughed hysterically. So much for that. Some cheapskate turns out to be a more worthy candidate for wife, a professor, who opened her husband's eyes. And I wonder what he'll sing when he finds out who gave up the baby for us, she thought vindictively as she drove up to the building. Hugh's main place of work in her Mercedes. But Vanessa was disappointed. Hugh wouldn't even listen to what his ex-wife actually wanted to tell him. "I don't care about Stephanie's past," he said. "She's the best woman in the world to me right now. I love her." Later, Hugh Wright filed for divorce and divided the property. After all the procedures, Vanessa bought a house in the village. "The boy will be fine there," she told colleagues. "There he will breathe fresh air, not exhaust fumes. If there's anyone she loves, it's an adopted child." They all thought as one. Soon Vanessa Wright retired. Now she could devote herself completely to Daniel, but Nikki was very disappointed in life. The young woman lived alone, although she had 1,001 opportunities to arrange her personal life. At one time she was sure Henry loved her more than life. And in the end, what? How could she trust a man after that? Nikki only went to work to visit her son's grave, yes, occasionally visiting her mother and her adopted Daniel, whom she considered her baby brother. Now she and her mother were, you might say, fellow sufferers. The boy was thrilled to have such a grown-up sister and delighted in her rare visits. She thought bitterly that her son would now be as old as Daniel. Some people thought that, after all these events, Nikki had begun to have problems in her head. Well, that was their right. She lived her life the way she saw fit. After her marriage to Professor, Stephanie felt happy and loved for the first time in her life. And yes, that love was mutual. Between the newlyweds were much more in common than you might assume. They both literally broke free from the shackles and now heartily enjoyed their true hard-earned happiness. Stephanie had embraced her faith. If someone had told her this 3 months ago, Stephanie would have laughed in his face. But after the wedding, she and Hugh had begun to go to church together, and when the young woman went there for the first time, she felt reborn. The atmosphere affected the new parishioner so strongly that she decided to confess her sins to her husband. Only now did Stephanie realize that it was wrong to start married life with a lie. "How will I look my children in the eye?" She thought about it and decided to have a frank conversation. I have something to tell you," Stephanie said quietly but firmly. "And if you want to leave, I understand." After a heart-to-heart talk with his wife, Hugh Wright had no such desire. On the contrary, understanding how difficult it was for Stephanie to decide to have this difficult conversation, he felt great respect for her. Stephanie felt as if she was freed from an incredibly heavy burden. "You was so good to tell me." Her husband nodded approvingly. "It's just a matter of telling Nikki. I don't want my daughter to suffer." "Yes, I understand." And Stephanie went to see Nikki. It had been an awful day at work, and her only wish was to take a warm bath and go to bed. But a cup of hot mint tea would be nice too. Waiting for the bath to fill up, Nikki took her robe and bath towel and, anticipating a good relaxation, made her way to the bathroom. The doorbell rang. Who the hell was that? She thought grudgingly. Nikki was surprised to see a young woman in a fox coat through the peephole, but opened the door. The stranger's face seemed vaguely familiar, but where had Nikki seen her? She couldn't remember. Maybe it was one of her patients, but why had she come to her house? "Hello, Nikki," quietly said the unexpected visitor. "Hello," she nodded. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Why don't you invite me into the house? I have serious, rather long conversation to have with you." "Well, come in," Nikki answered after a moment's thought. She wondered what the woman wanted to talk to her about so seriously. "Let's go into the kitchen. Would you like some tea? Or do you prefer coffee?" "No, thank you. That's all right." "If I may, I'd like to get right to the point." "Well, the point is the point." "Nikki, don't you recognize me?" Suddenly the guest asked. "Should I?" "Maybe you should at least introduce yourself." "Oh, yes. I'm sorry. My name is Stephanie. I don't think my name will tell you anything, though. And yet, for some reason, I should remember you." Frankly, Nikki was beginning to get a little annoyed. "Now, Stephanie, you wanted to get to the point. So let's get to the point." "All right, then listen." Nikki listened to the confession, and she felt like Stephanie was retelling the plot of a soap opera. She'd always known her mother was capable of many things, But it was one thing to ruin her marriage by any means necessary, and quite another to replace a child and take it for herself. A sophisticated revenge, however, Vanessa Wright came up with, and a very cruel one at that. Crazy thought to shock Nicky. Daniel is my son. My son. And Henry. Poor Henry. He really isn't guilty of anything to me. Forgive me. Stephanie finished her story and got down on her knees. Get up, Nicky said. Yes, the father's wife answered, slowly rising. Yes, I understand that's unforgivable. What's the big deal? The landlady sighed. God will forgive you. Stephanie didn't know why, but she wanted Nicky to forgive her. And even if she didn't, her soul was now completely clean. Nicky suddenly thought that the water in the tub must have gotten cold by now. What the hell is water when there's such passion in here? She thought as she watched her guest put on her coat. Stephanie, she called. Yes, she smiled shyly. Thank you. The woman nodded sadly and said goodbye. Take care of yourself. And I'm sorry again. Hugh and I are leaving in a week, and it's important for me to leave with a clear conscience. Nicky nodded, and when Stephanie left, she started pacing around the apartment. No, after all, her mother was a monster for whom nothing was sacred. Everyone involved in this difficult story, she, Henry, her father, Stephanie, and even little defenseless Daniel, were puppets, and the almighty Vanessa enjoyed pulling the strings and enjoying this macabre spectacle. That's all right. Now Nicky was going to give her a hell of a time. The enraged daughter hastily dressed and rushed to her mother. Fatigue was relieved. Vanessa Wright didn't feel well, probably blood pressure, she thought, and took a pill. It had been half an hour, but it didn't get any better. Mommy, are you sick? Daniel asked, frightened, noticing the unnatural expression on her face. It's okay, honey, the woman whispered. I'm going to feel better now. It's okay. Vanessa collapsed to the floor and realized with horror that she could not get up, and then she lost consciousness. Mommy, the baby screamed. Mommy, get up, I'm scared. But Vanessa didn't answer. She just stared at one point and breathed heavily. I'll go get Nicky now, the kid said, and somehow he got dressed and ran out of the house. Daniel ran so fast that he didn't notice the hole. Luckily, he had a firm grip on the snow-covered, and therefore not too slippery edge, that helped the boy climb out of the hole. But his pants were soaked. When Nicky arrived at her mother's house, she knocked determinedly, but found that the doors weren't locked tightly. Strange, she thought, in this cold. Nicky felt uncomfortable. It looked like the explanations would have to wait. And when she entered the house and saw her mother lying on the floor, senseless, not to mention the absence of Daniel, she felt sick. Fortunately, Vanessa's life was out of danger. After administering first aid to her mother, Nicky rushed to find her son. After wandering through the woods for 20 minutes, Nicky thought doomfully that there was little hope of successfully finding the baby. What if he was eaten by wolves? With horror, she thought. No, not that. I couldn't bear to lose my son a second time. The frost was terrible, and Nicky was wearing a light jacket and jeans. Her short boots filled with snow, and the young woman couldn't feel her feet at all. Nicky looked ahead and couldn't believe her eyes. A light was burning about 200 yards away. It's a hunting lodge, she thought happily, and with the last of her strength, she headed for the light. And when Nicky peeked through the window, she thought it was fate that had brought this Stephanie to her. And how could she not, when none other than Henry was tending the cottage and their son was sleeping in the bed in the corner? She mechanically pushed open the door, which appeared to open inward, and almost fell at Henry's feet. Nicky, he muttered in amazement. Yes, it's me, the ex-wife exclaimed, throwing herself into his arms. And now we will always be together. Forgive me, darling, now I know that you're not guilty of anything. Nicky, he whispered, stroking her face and wiping away her tears. Nicky, I'm not letting you go anywhere else. And you don't have to, laughing and crying at the same time, Nikki said. I have so much to tell you, especially that our son is alive and he's right beside us now. Tell me more about that, Henry said in amazement. Nestled in her lover's arms, Nikki told him about her mother's shenanigans, and in the corner, their baby boy snoozed. Unbelievable, I thought Henry. I just can't get my head around it. Vanessa Wright is a piece of trash, but she wasted 5 years. 6 months went by. Stephanie got probation for complicity and child fraud, so the move had to be postponed. She would have to report to the police for 2 years. But that was the little things in life. Now Stephanie is not afraid of anything, because she has a beloved husband by her side, and in 7 months there will be 3 of them. The Wright couple is in touch with Nikki and Henry, and they are happy to be a family again. Vanessa Wright is seriously ill, but Nikki, despite her mother's remorse, flatly refused to take care of her. The best thing her daughter could do for her was to put her in a paid nursing home. The elderly woman knew she had gotten what she deserved. It could have been worse. At least in a private nursing home, Vanessa gets quality care and socialization with the other residents. Daniel was surprised to learn that Nikki and Henry were his parents, and the one he thought was his mother was his grandmother. To all his inquiries, Nikki replied, "It's a game, my son. You'll understand when you grow up." Really, it's hard to understand, she thought. Grandma was just kidding. Henry added thoughtfully, "It's a good thing Daniel isn't that old, and it's not too late to make things right." Hugh Wright's anniversary passed in a cordial atmosphere. Stephanie turned out to be a wonderful hostess, and Nikki's father was crazy about his young wife. "We had a good time," Henry said. Already at home when Daniel was asleep and Nikki was applying her night cream to her face. Hugh Wright was looking younger, and the future of fatherhood looked good on him. "I hope it suits you too," Nikki smiled slyly. "Get into character, honey." "What do you mean?" The husband didn't immediately understand. "Why are you so clueless? I wanted to tell you tomorrow, but now that I am..." "Nikki." "Is it true?" Henry interrupted her cheerfully. "Of course. God, it's just a miracle. I love you. I love you too," Nikki whispered, nuzzling him on the shoulder. "But I don't think it's a miracle. It's supposed to be a reward for what we've been through." Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.